Good morning. Yeah, good to see everyone. So I want to start from the back. This is like something to explain to you the evolution of this shiur. I'm going to try to discuss the development of minhagim, and hopefully by the end of the shiur, I will convince some of you that Kitniot, the minhag of Kitniot, the Isra of Kitniot is, the greatest thing that happened to Am Yisrael since, sliced bread, sliced matzah on, But because I'm very fond of it, I'll explain to you why. But first, I want to start with how sort of like the evolution of this year. And this is this piece that I saw in Yediot Achronot, I think 12, 13 years ago, when the Alei Yarok party, the Green Leaf Party, was still a thing. They had for those people who aren't familiar with it, they had one plank in their platform, and that was the legalization of marijuana. They all actually usually came pretty close. They were, of all the protest parties, they were the one that came closest to actually getting seats in the Knesset. They usually polled about roughly about 2% of the population. With this one, this one plank. This was their only issue. And around election time, right, this came out. So this was a marijuana kshera rak le'ochlei kitniot. Okay? Remember, marijuana is now it's decriminalized. And we'll talk about that also. But what? No, so when I saw it, I looked at it, I said, I thought brownies were chametz gamur. But anyway, however, having said that, marijuana is kshera l'ochlei kitniot. This is very interesting in the sense of I'll just read part of it. Yachad im halechem v'apitol yeltzu tzarchei hasamim haYehudim levater gam al marijuana. So those people who are drug users are going to have to give up marijuana together with their pitot. Piskei halacha rabbanim, their poskim, who came out with the following psak, and it's actually number 10, is the psak of Rabbi Yitzchak Weiss, who was the Av Beitin of the Eda Chareditz. It's like, what's he giving a psak about marijuana about? But and we'll talk about that maybe later on in terms of the background for that. But Kabut tzrichatam shel zirei hamarijuana b'chag muteret ach v'rak l'ochlei kitniot. So it's only permissible for those people who eat kitniot, and this was you could see that it doesn't matter what the plank is and what whether it's misorah, not misorah, good Yiddish cup is there, because bitnua alei yarok shalamda lachrona shiur b'dinei halacha. So in this party, the Greenleaf Party, not known for its religiosity, korim l'chovevei hatzemach lizaher. So you should be very careful during Pesach. However, see the thumb coming across the page. L'umat yamim kitikunam shebehem nitan liistachsech rak imachok v'mishtara. In other words, if it's kitniot, that means the rest of the year, right? That it's you should be consuming it, right? So that's why they grabbed onto this psak halacha. So okay. That's ancient history. There's no Alei Yarok party anymore. Marijuana has been decriminalized. My guess is that within the next few years, it will become legalized entirely, the way that it is in most states in the United States and many other countries at this point. But okay, we'll see what happens. So, is marijuana kitniot, right? And we'll come back to that. We will get to that, but first let's talk about kitniot as a whole, right? And the discussion about it. So we're all familiar that kitniot is not chametz, right? So where did this iser grow from? Where did it sprout from? All puns intended. Lo tochal alav chametz. Right, so the pasuk says very clearly, "Lo tochal alav chametz, shivad yamin tochal alav matzot lachem oni." Right, so So you should not eat the Korban Pesach with chametz. You should eat it with matzot, the bread of affliction. Fine. This connection in the pasuk leads to a very important halacha, namely that something which is chametz has to have the potential to be matzah, and vice versa. In other words, you can't. In other words, matzah by definition has to be something that if you were to leave it, it would become chametz. It can't be something which is neutral, if you will. And so, what then can become chametz? And there is this misorah, which many of us are familiar with, that there are the so-called 5 grains. Right? 5 grains, and they are delineated in the Mishnah in Pesachim. Number 2, Elu dvarim she'adam yotzei behem yidei chavoto b'Pesach. So these are the 5 grains from which you can make matzah on Pesach: chitim, so'orim, kusmin, shifon, shibolet shua. Right, which are generally translated as wheat, barley, spelt, rye, and oats. Especially with regard to the oats, the question of whether what they call shibolet shual is what we call oats or not, and that's actually halacha l'masa issue, because oats, of all of these grains, the only one which is gluten-free is oats. And so for people who want to make matzah and there are very, if you think regular hand shmura is expensive, right? Go take a look at, really break the bank for your oat shmura matzot, right? And there's a question: are you yotzei really? Because are they really oats? And one of the issues is, well, is gluten a factor in determining these grains, right? So b'diavad, it's not recommended for people who aren't gluten intolerant one way or another, but for those people who are celiac, whatever it is, so that is because the Mesorah has become that what we call oats are considered to be the shibolet shual, so then you can have it. I've tasted that one of them, right? There are many reasons for people who are not gluten intolerant to avoid those matzot. Okay. So that is those are the 5 grains. Fine. However, the Gemara, in explaining this, and by the way, this has halacha not only with regard to matzah, not only with regard to kamet, but basically with regard to the definition of bread. Because, so if you want the question of what do you take challah from, for example, if you make a dough, so do you make is there a chiyuv of challah or not? The question, of course, of brachot. Do you make hamotzi lechem min haaretz on something which is, or barei minei mizanot, which is made from it? And you can understand now with the barei minei mizanot, a little bit of a segue into the next line of the Gemara. Matnitin de lo Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. Our Mishnah is not like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. The Amar orez min daganhu. V'chayavin al chimutzo karet. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri is a Tana of the 4th generation, I believe, and he is of the opinion that rice is also, there really aren't 5 grains, there are 6 grains, and the 6th grain is rice, and you have, as a result, all the halachot of the other grains apply to rice as well. Rice, just historically speaking, was introduced. The other 5 grains are native to to this area, to the Near East. Rice is not. It's coming from Southeastern Asia, and it was introduced into this area a couple of about I think 150, 200 BCE or so. So it makes sense for there to be machloket tanaim as to how do I view rice. It was, or even then, it wasn't a major cash crop, but certainly not in the Eretz Yisrael area, maybe in Bavel more so. But here it wasn't an issue, so there was this machloket. Now, so is the halacha like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri or not? So we are familiar with the idea that it's not. Though there is that, without getting into the details, why we make a mizonot on rice and say at the same time say barei nefashot. It's sort of like a little bit of a wink towards Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, but basically the halacha is not like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. However, how do we know that? Right? So Misora. But there's a Gemara which says it explicitly. The Gemara is actually directly with regard to Pesach. Number 3, Mai Shnei Tafshilin. So we're all familiar with the Ka'arat Pesach, the Seder plate. There is no mention, by the way, of a plate in the Gemara or in the Gaonim. That comes up in the Rishonim. The idea of the Ka'ara. However, it's based on the Gemara that say the Mishnah Heviu Lifanav, that the Mishnah says at the Seder, this is what was brought or is brought before the people who are having their Seder. And on that plate, or not plate, well, I guess you have to bring it with something, on that tray, whatever it is, are Shnei Tavshilin. What?
That's because in those days they used to bring a small table.
Right, it could be on table, it could be whatever, it could have been on a plate. The plate itself doesn't.
The tabletop was
right, it becomes an issue later on, like what, how should you arrange these? Right? Most of our Seder plates, right? Most of us don't think about it. We just see if it says on the Seder plate, Beitzah, you put the egg there, right? And whatever. But there's a question, what is the proper order? Most of the Seder plates are arranged based on the Ari, who based it on the Esser Sfirot. That starting with the matzot on top and basically Chabad going all the way down, and the Ka'ara itself is the Shechina. Okay, it's but that's the Ari. The Gra had a different way. The Ramah had a different way. A different shear. However, what are these Shnei Tavshilin? It just says 2 cooked items. Right? The almost universal minhag that we have of the Zroa and the Beitzah. Right, and it's also another universal minhag is to introduce obscure English words into Jewish practices. Right, there's only a cruse of oil on Chanukah, and there's only a shank bone on Pesach. But the Zroa is it's first mentioned, to the best of my knowledge, only in the 12th century, and that, as I said, becomes a near universal minhag. To have those. It's not in the Gemara at all. It's not in the Gaonim. So, Shnei Tavshilin, Amar Rav Huna, Silka v'aroza. So, Rav Huna ran a vegan Seder. What he had were beets and rice. He didn't have an egg, and he didn't have a shank bone. He had beets and rice. The Gemara then continues and talks about different shitot, and here, by the way, these are both cooked. None of them are roasted, right? So we're all familiar with the minhag to roast, and that's based on a different shita in the Gemara of Rabbi Yosef. Again, another shir about the ka'ara and what we have. But here, in terms of Rava, have mahader silka va'aroza. So Rav Huna is a very important Mora, a Talmud of Rav and of Shmuel, primarily of Rav. So one of his Talmidim, or a Talmid of a Talmid, Rava made sure that he would have beets and rice on his Ke'ara. Why? Hoil v'nafik mi pimud Rav Huna. If this is what Rav Huna said, it's you say, okay, minag agra. So it's like minag Rav Huna. If it's minag Rav Huna, so I'm going to have that on my Seder plate as well. Amar Rav Ashi. So Rav Ashi, who's a few generations later, says, Shma mina de Rav Huna. We can make the following deduction based on Rav Huna. And maybe this is what Rav Huna had in mind. Certainly what Rav Ashi thinks Rav Huna had in mind. Let zechayish lahad Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. No one, we don't have to be concerned about maybe Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri's shita is correct. In other words, perhaps the reason why Rav Huna put rice in the center of his Seder table was to tell everybody, this is not chametz, right? There's no better way of making sure that people accept that psak halacha than to say, here is the Rav Huna eating rice at his Seder. We're going to see in a moment, not a moment, in about half an hour or so, that it doesn't always work. You'll understand what I mean when I get to it. But that was it. Rav Huna had his rice. Therefore, we know that the halacha is not like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. Rice is not considered to be one of the grains that can become chametz. You can't make matzah out of rice. Fine. Fast forward now, approximately 900 years. 8 to 900 years forward. And this is not the first mention, but it's certainly the most important mention of this mitzvah, this minhag of Kitnios. It's mentioned in a more obscure work about 100 years earlier, Rav Elazar Mi Worms, but it's also not mentioned with regard in both instances. You'll see what's not mentioned, and here it is. Al Kitniot. Now this is the Sefer Mitzvot Katan. Sefer Mitzvot Katan is one of the most influential halachic works of the Ashkenazic world. It was written by Rav Yitzchak Mikorvil in the end of the 13th century. He wanted to write a Sefer Halacha that would be accessible to people. Right? There's an earlier work called Sefer Mitzvot Gadol, which is, as you might imagine, it's a larger work, more it deals with a listing of mitzvot and with an expansion as to ideas. Sefer Mitzvot Katan is more of a handbook. So in effect, it's the Shulchan Aruch, or maybe even the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch of its generation. We have hundreds of manuscripts of it. It was printed, and this is long before the printing press. It was a very popular work, and this is the following paragraph here. Al kitniyot kigon pulim va'adashim. So legumes that are, for example, beans and lentils. Right? Rice isn't mentioned for the simple reason that rice wasn't available in Northern Europe in the Middle Ages. So maybe occasionally somebody would bring it from the Far East with the spices, but basically, it wasn't a crop that they were familiar with. It certainly doesn't grow in that area. So yesh nogin isur lo'ochlam b'Pesach. There are those who do not refrain from eating it on Pesach. V'chein harav Shmuel me'evro. And this was the position of Rav Shmuel me'evro. Aval harav Rabbeinu Yechiel v'shar hagdolim. However, Rabbeinu Yechiel miPariz, who was arguably the most important of the Tosafos of the mid-13th century, and was also the father-in-law of Rav Yitzchak Mikorvil, not only his Rabbi, but also his father-in-law. Shar Gdolim ayu nagim behen heter.
It's supposed that he had it on his Karat Seder as a sixth item.
I'm not familiar with that. I've never heard that. It might be this a conflation of what was said with regard to Rav Huna in the Gemara. But okay, but I never heard that. And I'd love to see the source if you can find it. That'd be great. B'kashim oda davar lahatir. However, as he's just quoted his father-in-law, and he says, nevertheless, it is very difficult to be lenient with regard to kitniot. Why? So he gives two reasons. Kevan she'acherim nahagu behen isur. Others are stringent. So, but what he means is that's the prevailing minhag. Okay, that's, I understand. It's Rabbeinu Yechiel and the other gedolim are going against, again, pun intended, going against the grain. Okay, they're trying to turn back the clock. And he says, no, you can't turn back the clock. That's number one. And davar shenohagim ha'olam isur mimei chachamim kadmonim. This is a universal custom that has been forbidden from the days of the early sages. What's he saying? He's saying that this is an old minhag. Okay, in other words, it's not something which is okay. We're arguing about it now, and most people are doing it. But Rabbeinu Yechiel thinks that no, this is a long, well-established minhag. Now, the next word, and I have to apologize, I fixed it on my computer. But what I sent here, 3 words are missing. He says that I don't even remember venire. Okay, that's an important word. If you have been write in that word venire. Okay, you could see that it would. I put it in the English, but it got cut off for some reason. Venire shenagu bo iser mishum chimutz. Shelo nahagu bo iser. Mishum chimutz. It would seem now I'm trying to figure out why it's us. So by that very first word venire, so that tells you that he doesn't know. This is his educated guess, right? Or maybe more than a guess, but it's his trying to understand, to make sense of a minhag which exists, which has existed for at least 100 years. In recorded history, it's listed for 100 years. It's become well spread, but we don't know exactly why. So I'm going to tell you why I think, but it's his svara. Nira, why? So first of all, why is it not? It's not because people are concerned that it is Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. Why? Deloto idshi bezeh. This is not something that people would make a mistake about. This is something that every school child is aware of, because right? The Mishnah lists 5. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri is the 6th, and matnita deloka Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. So any boy in Cheder who's learning Gemara is going to know that the halacha is not like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. This is not something that we have to be particularly concerned about. Right? You don't even have to reach the point that you're learning the Mishnah, right? If you think about it, when you learn your brachos in first grade, second grade, and they say, okay, you make a mizonot on this, and you make a motzi on that, etc. So everyone knows that rice is not one of them, and that's and they didn't even have rice. Remember, right? We're talking about beans and legumes, right? Where it's clearly not an issue. De'enu baladei chimat. Ela chamishim milvad. Ela asru mishum didagan maasei kedera v'kitnit maasei kedera gezerah ha atuha. So the two reasons that people are familiar with, most of them, are already found here in the Smak. But again, I just want to stress that this is thinking as to why, as opposed to saying definitively this was a gezerah because of this. So one is that porridges and the like, so they look the same. If you think of farina, for example, right? So you can get wheat farina, for those people coming from North America, you know what I'm talking about? Or wheatina, it's called wheatina, wheat farina. And you can get rice farina. And they look basically the same, right? Rice farina is whiter, and wheat is a little browner, but they look more or less the same. I make a cholent. I have a daughter-in-law and a grandson now, not from the same family, who are celiac. So when they visit, so we make a cholent, so it's a gluten-free cholent. So I use red rice, right? And you don't use the barley. And the cholent, okay, it's redder because it's red rice. It's better than white rice for the cholent, but it looks like a cholent. And so so as a result, people could get confused. You see one dish, another dish. So that is one possibility. V'gam yesh bekomot she'osin pat mikitniot. You can even make bread. You can make flour and make some kind of bread out of the kitniot. Va'ati lechlufe bedaisa shuhu maaseh kedera. So you might use it instead of the wheat farina, the wheatina. Avamina yerakot, but vegetables. The lo damila dagan klal. Nobody's going to make a mistake if you have I don't know, broccoli or whatever it is. The gam pa'amim. So this is the second reason. Gam pa'amim tfuwa mu'urevet bahem.
These are considered.
Okay, get to it in a second. Okay. Yeah.
Potatoes?
Yeah, okay, we'll get to it. V'i efshar lidvaro yafa. The second reason is, and the truth is the two reasons are kind of related in the following historical note. This is before I started thinking about Kitnios and this at all, but this factoid stuck in my mind. Back in January of 2000, or it might have been December of 1999, I don't remember which one, there was a New York Times magazine piece where they asked, I think it was 50, but it might have been fewer, whatever, intellectuals, thinkers, as to what from their perspective, they're looking back at the last millennia, what was the most important innovation of the last 1,000 years. Right, and different people, the steam engine, whatever, all the things you can decide what you think is the most important. So Umberto Eco, right? So the author of the Name of the Rose, what? Yeah, and said an Italian philosopher. I think he passed away recently. I'm not sure, but so he said the introduction of the cultivation of the bean in Northern Europe in the beginning of the 11th century. Right? And he said that so everybody said, that's why it stuck out. I mean, he was sort of a contrarian, so he probably just tried to figure something out that would get people going. So he said, why was that? Because it allowed people to have the peasants to have a cheap and available source of protein. Right? And that led to a higher nutrition level, which in turn led to more education, which turned to advancing of society, etc. Okay, that was his argument. Okay, which I think again, whether that's the most important innovation of the millennia or not, the point though is that a lot of times very small things, right, have very large ripple impact, and so you see both of these elements here in the tshuva. The idea that he says there are those people who make bread out of the legumes, right? Why do they do that, right? Are they looking, is it because of the culture? Because they might not necessarily be able to afford regular flour, and they're making this, and this is a good substitute. Crop rotation is introduced at this point in Northern Europe. And so people are changing from beans one year, or lentils in their fields, and the next year they're planting wheat and continuing the process. So every year you harvest, you plow over it the next year, things have fallen into the ground, they sprout up, right? And you have the contamination of those products. So you're going to have in your lentils, you're going to have wheat kernels, barley kernels, whatever it is that was planted in the previous year, so that it's a real concern. It's not, contamination, by the way, is still a concern. I mean, people should be aware by the U.S. FDA standards, you can have up to 8 insect parts in a Hershey bar. Okay? On average, you should be happy. On average, there are only 4 insect parts in a Hershey bar. But they're there. In other words, there are insects in the factory, right? And so you're going to have contamination. It's unavoidable, right? They test the average. They take a Hershey bar every now and then, and they test it, to see how much insect parts are in it. And halachically, right? Halachically, it's batal, right? It's not. Don't worry about it. The point is, right? We consume these things all the time. We don't think about it. And so here, suddenly, when you're dealing with chametz, what? I'm sorry. I'm going to think. Okay. Right. I hope no one has the. Right. Okay. So you should even know what the elite standards are. Anyway, the point though is but anyway, these things are. They happen, and so on Pesach though, right? I said, let's say from a halachic perspective, so the insect parts, right, are batel in the chocolate, but but chametz, right, is oser b'kol shehu, right? The smallest amount is oser. We don't have bittul when it comes to chametz.
Except that it's not chametz.
What?
Except that it's not chametz because it's not one of the 5 grades.
No, but I'm saying the wheat. You'll have wheat inside.
But the other things that we're talking
right, but if you have a little wheat, correct, but you have a little wheat inside. In other words, you're making your lentils, right? And there are a couple of grains of wheat in that lentil, right? So the whole pot is chametz, halachically, right? So there's a concern. So since there is what?
Before Pesach, it's the
So first of all, you'd have to make it before Pesach, right? That'd be number 1. And number 2, right? Most people aren't going to, without refrigeration, they're going to cook on Pesach. That's number 1. You take your bag of lentils and you put it into your pot and you cook. So So fine. So what does Sephardim do? Right? If you've ever been to a Sephardi home and they make rice on Pesach, so they are incredibly careful to, much more so. I mean, a lot of people will check rice for bugs and things like that. Make a quick scan, but they're very, very careful to sort the rice before they do it. So you can understand why people would just say, you know what, it's not worth it for a week. You'll live without lentils, right? You'll live without beans, and we'll have, you'll manage. Right? That's the that's the rationale, if you will, for the Gezerah. Now, what I'm not going to get into the. Don't have the time to get into for all of the different halachic discussions about if you have the minhag to aser kitniot. So, what are the laws of bittul for kitniot? There's a batal in shisha, batal in rov, etc. What happens if you're in a shat hatchak and you don't have other sources of food? Can you now use kitniot on Pesach, right? All sorts of shilos, and it could very well be that the Bekilim, Rabbeinu Yechiel, and through the generations, there have been. You can make a list, and people have made lists of the different Rishonim and Achronim, Ashkenazic, Sephardic, etc., who have pushed back against this. And the fact that I'm still giving you the shir about marijuana and kitniot tells you how successful they were, right? So but they push back. When do they most likely push back? Frequently, not because people said, "Oh, you know what?" When people say, "Oh, I really wish I could be a Sephardi on Pesach," right? Really, you can't manage without rice for a week, right? Really, that's what people say, "Oh, I don't know, cocoa pebbles, they're kosher Pesach for this Friday." Okay, so you'll eat your matzah, your matzah cereal, whatever it is. But becomes Friday. We'll talk about that also. The point though is that when did people really push back? When there was a serious food shortage, right? So especially before the New World was discovered, right? There are no potatoes. Right, in Northern Europe, they're only going to be introduced in the 16th century, 17th century. So, what are they eating? So they're eating matzahs, yeah.
But is there a question of whether you're only talking about the kitniot that were around at the time of the?
We'll talk about it. Okay. So that is where we stand right now. Okay, so this is where, however, already, right. There is you can see here, there's now been an expansion of the minhag. Where's the expansion? This last paragraph. The chardal, kimo ken yesh la'asro b'shem Pesach. Mustard should also be forbidden on Pesach, mishum d'hu midei de midgan. Right? Because it's something which is a legume. Okay? Right? It's threshed in a similar manner, right? So he's acknowledging alpha mehem mutar mikom makom ata yesh la'achmir b'dorot halalu she'enam b'kiyim kol kach b'isur v'heter k'dorot rishonim k'deperish Rav Saadia. So since now, even though, right, nobody's going to make a mustard porridge, and there are no concern that you're going to have wheat mixed in your mustard. But nevertheless, right, and he's saying this is an extension of the minhag, right? We are now going to extend it to mustard, right? Which explains also the green beans and the peas, etc. In other words, these are extensions of if you have lentils, they grow in a pod. Right, so things that grow in pods are going to now be included in the minhag. Right, exactly what time, at what point did peas? When were they introduced? Right, so I've never looked into it. You could probably find the first recorded mention of peas being included in Kitnios, somewhere in my guess is the 15th or maybe the 14th century. Now, that's when now you see a creeping out of the minhag, right? But that's what minhagim do, right? By the way, this is why I love Kitnios, right? Because it's a really great case study in what minhagim are, right? Minhagim are, to my mind, really the lifeblood of Yadut, right? It's not just that you're opening up a sefer and saying, is this a mutter, is this usher, etc. What are people doing in their kitchens? Right? That's really, and so you're right. For whatever the reason, we'll take his rationale. Somebody said, you know what, Gewalt. There were wheat in the lentils this year. We really shouldn't have lentils, right? And that minhag spreads around in his community, right? Some Rav makes that little takana, call it gzeira, in his own community, and it spreads, whatever, right? And then, so now you just see it's okay. What about mustard, Rabbi? Oh, of course, mustard's mutter, but later on, could be 100 years later, 150 years later, in another place, so they're including mustard, and now the smak, who's writing up a Sefer Halacha, is saying this is what's nohug, it makes sense, and we should keep it. Yeah.
How is this all connected to Pesach? What's the idea?
Okay.
What's the idea?
So what is it connected to Pesach? So this is the connection to Pesach. First of all, it doesn't necessarily connect it directly to Pesach, but it is. But here it reflects. It's a very deep. Okay, it reflects a very deep concern, right? My mother Zechron Avracha told me a childhood memory, right, which traumatized her. Okay, this is in the I guess in the late 30s, and there was some bottled kichlach, I don't know exactly what it was, that she as a girl, she's a young girl, and she put it on the Pesach dik counter. It was on 2 days before Pesach, she put it down on the Pesach counter. And my grandmother, give out! Right? You're making everything chametz, and you're doing this, you're doing that, right? And now I have to recasher the whole counter, right? And, a couple of years later, when she was a little older, my mother asked my grandmother, said, why did you do that? There's no reason halachically to do that. She said, I know. Of course there wasn't any reason, right? But you stopped, from that point on, you never even came close to mixing chametz in the kitchen, right? Fine. So, okay, I don't know. My grandmother didn't pay for the psychologist bills. The point, though, is I'm not recommending this as necessarily, parental, but there is a deep, another story of my mother. Also, but I have to get back to this. When Reynolds Wrap was introduced in the 50s in America, so there were door-to-door salesmen, and a door-to-door salesman rings her, her doorbell. That's the word. On Erev Pesach, and saying, madam, I'd like to, discuss with you innovative uses of, aluminum foil. And my mother, had a good sense of humor. She said, oh, that sounds really, really good idea. She did this in Miami Beach. There were not a lot of Jews around there at that time. And so she said, come on into my kitchen, which was covered from floor to ceiling with aluminum foil. Right? And the guy just says, oh, I guess I don't have to talk to you. Okay? So this is what it's a deeply, it's very, very deeply rooted sense of, Pesach is something which is really deeply rooted in our collective psyche, and Kitnios is a reflection of that. So you could say intellectually it makes no sense, right? And you're in very good company. Number 5, here's the Beit Yosef. V'let techash lidvarim halalu. Nobody is concerned with these matters. Zulati Ashkenazim. Just those benighted Ashkenazim, right? No one normal has any concern, any problem with Kitnios, right? You're right, any Sephardi will laugh at you. Okay, fine. So there are lots of things that we'll laugh about at the Sephardim. That's also fine, right? In other words, minhagim develop, and they are part of, as I said, they become part of the maybe the epigenetic, right? Maybe not the DNA, but the epigenetic level of who we are, and that really, I think, makes things very important. So, just to show you, just very very quickly before, because we want to get to the main point, which is something is that. So here you have how deeply rooted it is. So you now move to the end of the 14th century in the Maharil, and the Minhagim of the Maharil Sefer Minhagim plays a very important role in Ashkenazic Pesach. The Ramah quotes him quite frequently. So he says the following in the middle of the paragraph, number 6. Al Yomar Adam, right? This is before the Beit Yosef. Al Yomar Adam, Kevan Shein Isur Midoraita En Lachush. Person shouldn't say, well, listen, there's no Isur Doraita here. We have no concern. The chol the gazu Rabbanan ha'over alav chayav bita va'over alo tasur min hadavar asher yerucha. Right? So what? Sorry? Okay, so this is an Isur Doraita. You're chayav mita for violating it. And he says, continues, skip to the next bold. Aval davar shepashut isuro ubal atiro mikoach minhag sham yisacher pi dover sheker. In other words, you're right. You can talk about minhagim, and minhagim are ta'ut, and they should be rolled back, etc. But if you're dealing with a minhag which is so deeply enrooted in, and I know that it's a minhag, right? But I have a minhag which is so deeply rooted and has such a long history, right? So let the mouths of those who speak falsely be sealed. Right? In other words, this is not something that you should, be. This is who we are. That's basically what he's saying. Other people have tried, a few hundred years later, quite famously, the Chacham Tzvi and Rav Yaakov Emden, his son, tried to push back against it, and Rav Yaakov Emden already says, I tried, didn't work, right? And the Afilu Ashmanim, now we have a new Isser, which is already mentioned perhaps a little bit earlier. Afilu Ashmanim shenasu midvarim mahem kmo ribel hichmiru. Right? In other words, originally, right, we're talking about things that could be mixed in and could be mistaken, and maybe there's rice, and maybe there's wheat, maybe it's rice, etc. All of these things, oil. Why should the oils of that are made from this, why should it be a problem?
It's not.
They were kidding. Now, there are those, and this is, by the way, part of it as well. There are those people who are not machmir for what's called mei kitniot, right, for the oils of kitniot, the derivatives of kitniot. There are those people who have that minhag. But the fact that the minhag has spread, right, is okay, an expansion of the idea. If you skip, I will put it at the end for a different reason, but if you take a look at number 11, which, as I said earlier, this is the Trumat Hadeshen, is a contemporary of the Maharil. So he says, שאלה, תבואה של מיני קטניות שאינן מחמשת המינים שנפל עליו מים, וקרוב לוודאי שנתחמצה. So now you have something which has been, it's not dry legumes, but they have been, there's water, and they've had the opportunity to start sprouting. I wouldn't call it like chimutz, but they've been exposed to moisture. Shari lahashot b'Pesach olav. Do you have to get rid of your kitniot before Pesach or not? Tshuva. So here's the tshuva. Yired shari. So number one, it's permissible, and this is the accepted minhag ad hayom, that there isn't a notion of kitniot she'avar alav haPesach, and you can keep your kitniot and you don't have to sell it, etc. V'nira gam kein demutar lehanot me'otat tfuah b'Pesach. Not only can you, not only is it not asur, but you can derive benefit from that grain. He's calling it a grain, but it means that those legumes, the rice, whatever it is. Kigon al yidei hadlaka mishemen zera v'shum shemin v'zera cannabis. Okay, so for example, by lighting the oils of whether it's sesame oil or cannabis oil, okay, cannabis, because cannabis is hemp, right? So they would be growing it mainly for commercial purposes, because you don't eat it, but for making rope and what have you, and the seeds would be used for oils, right? And I don't know what the CBC content was. Maybe they were very popular because of that. I don't know. But so the oil was there. So you want to use that oil for lighting, for fuel. So that's permissible. Okay, and that is also accepted halachically. That deriving benefit, even though chametz itself, it's asur b'hana'ah, forbidden to derive any benefit. When it comes to kitnios, it's permissible. Okay, so that's the. So you see, that is there any pattern to this? Mustard becoming asur, oils being asur, at the same time that it's not extending to the dinim of chametz shavel of a Pesach or hana'ah. So I don't think there's any pattern that you can really discern and say, oh, there's, it's this is the logic behind it. But rather, it's sort of piecemeal, right? Questions come up. We don't have kitniot in our kitchen, so how do we have to? So you ask maybe if someone else had been had been more influential or as influential as the Trumat Hadeshen, had been asked the question, and he said, I think it should be usher. Maybe the minhag would have become that we wouldn't have Ashkenazim wouldn't have kitniot in their home on Pesach. This is the nature of minhagim. Right? It's not going to always be, that you can just say, okay, there's a logic and there's a book and we just follow down the road. But it's organic. So things are going to evolve and things are going to change based on the question at the time, and then it's going to move in different directions. Now, we move forward now to the 20th century. And and so I want to just show you two opposing approaches in terms of psak halacha. One at the beginning of the 20th century, one of the leading poskim in Europe, from the Avnei Nezer, Rav Avram Bornstein, the Sokotchover Rav, so he had the following very important posik of the early 20th century. So he was asked the following question, also with regard to oil, which already has been the dominant approach is that the mei kitniot, the shemen, the oil is asur. So now, what about shemen ha-meiraps, asher nagu be'isur, rapeseed oil? This is, number 8. Rapeseed oil. Now, here's which we call canola. Okay, which is one of the great innovations of the advertising age. Right, rapeseed is not going to sell well. Right, so if you call it canola, which is Canadian oil, that's what it comes from because they're large fields. Now, rapeseed is rap is Latin, by the way, for turnip. Right, which is why turnip. It's related to the turnip. And that's why in Hebrew it's called liftit. Lefet is a turnip, and in and canola or the rapeseed is called liftit. So if you see that specifically on chocolate, a lot of times they'll say la'ochle liftit levad. The elite chocolates say la'ochle liftit. Okay, what that's saying, this isn't your regular canola, your regular kitniot. This is specifically canola that's being used, and we'll talk about it in a second. So now the question is, what about rapeseed? Now, what's the history of rapeseed? Rapeseed is inedible. Right? You can't eat rapeseed. It's very high tannic acid level, and the oil itself, which is what made it wasn't particularly popular early on. I'm growing up in the 70s. I don't remember. The canola oil was only introduced, I think, in the 80s, right? You had corn oil, you had mazola oil was the big oil at the time, and the oil itself was also very bitter, so it wasn't particularly popular in terms of its use, so I'm not sure whether it was because of breeding and that they were able to have a breed of the rapeseed which wasn't as high in tannic acid, or it was in the production process that they were able to get the oil, the acid out of the oil. That's when it became popular in the 80s, and it grows, huge fields in Canada. So that's why the canola. And it's okay. So we're all familiar with canola oil. So now the question was, you can't eat the seed, right? So the whole reason for oils is because maybe the seed, and now the seed because it might get mixed into the wheat, right? Okay, all of that. So if you have an oil which is totally, right, you don't have that concern at all, that oil should be mutter, right? That was the question to the Avnei Nezer. The Avnei Nezer, because of time, I'm not going to read inside right now, but he says it's usher. Why does he say it's usher? Because he says, listen, if you were to have, to understand the thinking here, is that if you were to have wheat germ oil, you can buy wheat germ oil, right? You take wheat and you make an oil out of it, and it's used in, generally in certain gourmet products. So, is that chametz?
No.
So the answer is the oil itself is not chametz, right? You had a dry press; it didn't come into contact with any liquid whatsoever, right? The oil is perfectly fine. So he said, fine. Rapeseed oil is perfectly fine until you bring it into your kitchen. Because what are you going to do with the oil? So if you're going to burn the oil, right, you're going to use it for lighting candles, whatever you want to do, so then it's fine, right? Which is what the Truman Adeshet said. But if you're going to now introduce it into your kitchen, right, and you're going to put it into batters, and you're going to be frying things, and you're going to be doing all sorts of things, so it's going to become the wheat germ oil. Is going to become chametz gamor in your kitchen, right? The same way that you have, beer is considered to be chametz gamor. Scotch is considered to be chametz gamor, right? So wheat germ oil is the moment that, in those cases, it's as the liquid was introduced earlier, but the moment that you have a liquid, so you're going to have chametz gamor. By the same token, if I have rapeseed oil, I should have the same concern on a kitniot level. Not that it's going to become chametz, but it'll become kitniot in your kitchen, so therefore it's usher. Okay, that's his rationale. Okay, what do you see from that? Right, I'm not saying that I came into Israel when canola was still considered to be not kitniot, and it hadn't been introduced in America when I first came, and and people were using it. I adopted that as my minhag, and my brother doesn't use canola oil. I use canola oil. Baruch Hashem, he eats at my home. But the point is that, okay, fine. You want to accept the psak, you don't want to accept the psak. It doesn't matter to me right now. The point, though, is that what he's doing is he's saying, when I'm looking at this shaila, I'm looking at it from halachic rule, using halachic rules. I'm looking at kitniot, and he says explicitly, I'm looking at kitniot as basically being rabbinic chametz. And once I have rabbinic chametz, I say, okay, I take the rules of the real chametz, and I apply them, it's a derivative of that rule, of that formula, and I apply it to the rabbinic side, and I come to the conclusion that if it's usher on the Doraita side, it'll be usher on a rabbinic level on the rabbinic side. That's his rationale. And again, you can accept it, you don't have to accept it, but understand what the thinking is. Now I come to it.
If it's usher on the rabbinic side, looking at it has different implications than what you butter and things like that.
Right. So then, okay, then that could be a pushback against the Avnei Nezer. You could say, well, if that's the case, why didn't they usher it behana'ah? Why didn't they say that there's chametz shavar of a Pesach? Why does it have a different rule of bittul than other things? In other words, so it would seem, which leads me to the next tshuva, which is tshuva of Rav Moshe. And Rav Moshe Feinstein in 1966, this is number 9. So he has the following question: Be'inyan pinat, im yesh bo chashash isur min hakitniot, right? And he dates the tshuva. It's almost exactly 59 years ago today, right? It was Chaf Dalet Adar, Tafshin Chafab, 1966, right? He was asked the question. So fine, I have this question, peanuts, right? So I told you earlier, Rav Huna's innovation to put rice on the Seder table, so that way no one holds like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. So it didn't work for Rav Moshe Feinstein. Why? Because I spoke to Rabbi Tendler Zichrono Livracha is his son-in-law, who told me that Rav Moshe in the 60s would give out peanuts at his Seder. Right? That was I throw marshmallows to my children, now to my grandchildren, when they answer questions correctly. Right? So Rav Moshe gave out peanuts. Right? So he had peanuts at his Seder. Right? Now, the peanuts is a fantastic example of what's going on. But first, let's go to the question. So he asked, "Hinei bidvar hapinat shekatavti shebarbe mekomot achlu otam b'Pesach." Right. So I wrote. It's not only that people have to speak to the family to find out what's at the Seder. Rav Moshe has written that the peanuts are permissible in many Kitnios. So the questioner asked him, well, one second, I read about George Washington Carver. I know a lot of the uses for peanut. You can have all sorts of peanut flour. You can do this, that, the other. I didn't mention George Washington Carver. But the point is, there are, hundreds of uses for peanuts, right? So it should be usser, right? It should be like kitniot. So he answers. So he says, listen, this is the bold, the third paragraph, the bold. So if you're asking me whether it should be usher or not, I said, listen, I know what, I can take a look at the smak, and I can take a look at and I can take a look at the halachic history and see what's usher, right? I'm not basing it on the rationale. There are certain things, and he says that the next paragraph, Kevan shelo tiknu b'kibutz chachamim l'rachol dvarim sheyesh chashash yit'arev behen minei dagan udvarim she'osin mehem kemach. There was never a formal takana that you should not eat things that are flour-like, or you should not eat things that look like the product that's made looks like chametz. A few years ago, I don't know if he's still saying it, Rabbi Ben Nun was trying to tell people all of those Pesach cakes that you can buy, made with potato flour, etc. And they're in the exact same packaging, the osem cakes or whatever, as the chametz varieties. Those should be aser. If you're choshesh for kitniot, this is much worse, right? You're eating exactly the same cake, right? All the gluten-free people are very happy this time of year. They stock up on these cakes because they have all sorts of stuff that potato starch, along with preservatives that are going to last for who knows how long. And this is so this is a brownie and that's a brownie, right? So it should be usher. So Rav Moshe says, right, that's not what the takana was, right? That might have been the rationale, but that wasn't the rationale. There was no takana. There was what? There was a custom. People had a minhag. It was a grassroots type of custom. It wasn't a top-down type of takana. It was a bottom-up kind of minhag. And it's much more organic as a result. And so he gives an example. Right? Potatoes are introduced in the 16th century, 17th century in Europe. They become the staple crop to the extent that, right, it's because of a New World crop that's introduced to Ireland that triggers a famine which sends the Irish to the New World. Right? So it's a crazy type of thing. Fine. This is the staple crop. But people tried to say, well, you should make potatoes usher because of kitniot, but it didn't work. It's because maybe people would have starved. Or maybe because it didn't make sense to include peanuts, to include potatoes. Right? So that doesn't have to be do it. He continues, so if you're coming from a place where they've included peanuts into kitniot, gesund to hate. I don't have a problem with it. I'm not saying you shouldn't. We have to have a banner with Mr. Peanut there, the planter peanut, and say it should be mutter. No, it can be usher, but let me keep giving out peanuts at my seder. That's basically Rav Moshe. Now, when I came, I grew up, and many of you I'm sure are familiar with this well. Back in the 70s into the 80s, so there was planter peanut oil. That was the oil that people would have, and it had an OUP or OKP. I remember the OKP, but it doesn't really matter, right? Hashkacha, right? I hadn't been in the States for almost 2 decades, well, not quite 2 decades, 15 years or so, for Pesach. And I went on Shlichut in the end of the 90s to Chicago for a few years. And I went to the store and I looked for planter peanut oil, right? I couldn't find it. So I asked one of the Rabbanim, in the community, where can I find the peanut oil for Kashla Pesach? And he just laughed at me. Right? He said, we haven't had that spirit here since 1969. I was like, there's no planter peanut. It's kitniot. Everybody treats peanuts as kitniot. Right? In that 15-year period, right, there was the switch. Similar type of thing with canola. Similar type of thing with, as I said, the general opinion is the beginning, this isn't going to be treated as kitniot. I think most people do treat it now as kitniot. Quinoa, right? I love quinoa. Okay, so here in Israel, I don't really like quinoa. What I'm trying to say is but quinoa is a case. So quinoa, in America, last I checked, it's not considered to be kitniot. Here in Israel, it is considered to be kitniot. There is a real concern, by the way, quinoa, with contamination, right? I've found not for Pesach. Quinoa, little grains, right? So fine, right? So fine. So it changes every year here. So now, 1 second. So a few years ago, I didn't see if it's still there. The Star K published, if you're buying quinoa, right, be very careful because there's contamination. You have to be careful. You have to sift it or get it with a hashgacha, etc., or get it with the hashgacha of the Rabbanut in Israel, la'ochlei kitniot bilvad. Because then you know that they've sorted it. So in Israel it's kitniot, here it's not kitniot, it's fine, right? So 1 second. What happened with peanuts? If I would ask with Moshe, not 59 years ago, but now, should I eat peanuts? Or Moshe, I think, would say, I can't vouch, he would say, no. It's been accepted as kitniot. I'm going to give you another example. 1 second. I am not familiar. I've looked, but I haven't. Not saying it doesn't. It's not out there. I'm not familiar with a single tshuva that talks about corn. As to corn and potatoes, peanuts, all New World crops, quinoa, etc. Corn is introduced. Why doesn't anyone ever think that it's not kitniot? Why isn't the question even asked? Right? So 1 second. So I think that, again, here's a great example. If you look at the back page next to the Idiot article, so this is an entry from a library, a dictionary, the dictionary Ernesto Klein, a very tragic story himself. It was a survivor. His whole family was killed, and he emigrated to Toronto. And he spent his decades there as a Rev, but he also worked on etymology, he had that training. So he asked, you ever wonder why corn is, here in Israel, is called tiras? Right? Where does that come from? Tiras. Right? Not maize, not corn. Why tiras? Right? So he gives it, you can read it through, but basically that when it was introduced in Europe, because it went through Turkish markets to get to Europe. So it was called, right, Turkish wheat, Turkish Weitz, right? The Hebraicism of Turkey is, without getting into the details, is tiras, right? That's why it's called tiras. We talked about marketing before, right? So anything called wheat of any kind is not going to make it into a Jewish kitchen on Pesach, right? And the reason why it's called corn is because until then, corn was used for grain. That's what corn means, right? You can look at old translations. They talk about the grain that Yosef gathered in Egypt. It's called corn, right? It's corn on the cob. It's grain on the cob, and then people just called it corn for short, and everything else stopped being called corn. So basically, it was called wheat. So nobody even thought for a second that this is going to come into my kitchen. Nobody had the shaila, right? Potatoes, well, we know what potatoes look like. So you can make flour out of potatoes. You can make potato starch. Great, but it's not a grain. So nobody ever thought about potatoes until somebody asked the shaila. When it came to corn, nobody asked the shaila. It was just part of the minhag, right? And so we don't have corn. It wasn't included by the smak. The smak didn't know from corn, but it doesn't matter. That's kitnios. Right? Also, by the way, and I apologize for going over time, the pushback in our community against it, right? Much more. The Charedim, they're going, holding on to kitniot with both hands, trying to figure out new Isurim all the time. With us, right, there's the pushback. Why? Right? So maybe people can give other reasons. I think it's very simple, right? The segregation between Ashkenazim and Sephardim in the Haredi world is a very serious thing for many reasons. But it's a serious thing. So the idea that in an Ashkenazic home you're going to have kitniot, Gewalt, right? Okay, that's for the Sephardim, and this is for the Ashkenazim. In our community, where you have approximately a third of all the marriages are marriages between the two kehilot, of mixed marriages, right, of different kinds. So what? So you're going. It just seems odd, right? I have, my daughter is married to a Moroccan. Fine young Moroccan young man, right? So there, by the way, is a good example. Moroccans don't eat rice, right? But that's because of a takana that was made. There was an infestation of wheat in the rice one year in the 18th century, and a takana was made in the community. We're not going to eat rice on Pesach anymore. But all the other things, hummus and corn and what have you, they eat, right? Because there was a takana, but everywhere else it's a minhag. So they eat kitniot on Pesach. They don't eat the rice, but they'll eat the other things. I'm not going to eat in my daughter's home. Right? She's not going to give us kitniot, but I'm not going to start saying, oh, maybe they're kalim or us, and this, that, the other. It's not only with the question of marriage. It's a question of people in the same community, etc. So it becomes has a different, it's not the same kind of isser, the same kind of minhag that it was when you had Ashkenazim in one country and you had Sephardim in another country, or very clear the segregation. The Charedim, it doesn't have that, and that's really the Charedim really do go overboard, if you ask me, with regard to some of the poskim in terms of their understanding of this particular minhag. But it's all part of the same idea. In other words, getting back to marijuana. Started, got to close. So to the best of my knowledge, no kashrut organization is willing to give a hashgacha all year round to any marijuana product in America. Right? I have a friend, of course, who told me that the medicinal marijuana that he has here in Israel has the hashgacha the badatz. Okay, but not for Pesach. I'm saying in general. I don't know why you need hashgacha, but okay. But so I don't think that's going to hold. That's my guess. Within 5-10 years, they're going to be the gummy bears all year round. They're going to be with hashgacha, right? Okay, CBC, we're going to buy all the edible products with marijuana are going to have, somebody's going to give a hashgacha, right? When there's just too much of a desire in the community to use it, so to say dakar hashgacha. Within when that happens, right, we'll find out whether cannabis is kitnios. Have a chag kosher v'sameach.